The night air on Saipan was heavy, thick with the smell of burned powder and tropical rain. The jungle had fallen eerily silent, broken only by the distant crash of waves against the island's northern cliffs. American Marines, exhausted from weeks of brutal combat, crouched in their foxholes, their fingers brushing cold triggers, eyes straining into the dark. They felt it before they saw it, an unnatural stillness, a sense that something monstrous was about to erupt from the shadows. Then, faint at first but growing louder, came the cries, bands, I, a roar of thousands echoing across the valley, shaking the ground beneath their boots. Through the gloom, shapes emerged, a tide of humanity, bayonets flashing, officers wielding samurai swords high, wounded soldiers limping forward with bandaged heads, some carried on stretchers. Even civilians, women and children clutching bamboo spears, stumbled behind them. 4,000 men and women charged into history that night, driven not by strategy but by desperation, by an ancient code that demanded death before surrender. What they didn't know was that they were running straight into the jaws of America's most coordinated killing machine, the devastating symphony of artillery fire. The last great Banzai charge had begun. July 6, 1944. Saipan, Northern Mariana Islands. The sun dipped low behind jagged mountains, casting long shadows across the battered island. Saipan was nearly lost. For 3 brutal weeks, American forces, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, alongside the Army's 27th Infantry, had pushed relentlessly northward, shattering Japanese defensive lines and cutting off supply routes. The once proud Japanese garrison of 32,000 men had been reduced to fewer than 5,000 combat-effective troops. Ammunition was scarce, food was nearly gone, and water, precious water, was so rare that men licked dew from leaves before dawn just to survive another day. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Sato, commander of the remaining forces, faced the truth he had long dreaded. His soldiers were trapped. There would be no reinforcements, no evacuation. The ocean at their backs and Americans on 3 sides left only 2 options: surrender, unthinkable under the Bushido Code, or death in battle. In a dimly lit cave headquarters, Sato sat hunched over a small desk, the air thick with the scent of kerosene lamps. His hand trembled as he wrote his final order, words that would echo across history. Whether we attack or whether we stay where we are, there is only death. However, in death, there is life. We must utilize this opportunity to exalt true Japanese manhood. I will advance with those who remain to deliver another blow to the American devils. His officers bowed solemnly. There was no protest. For them, Gyukyus, to shatter like a jewel in one final glorious act of sacrifice, was the only honorable path. Preparations began immediately. Every man still able to hold a weapon was organized into attack groups. Sailors, aviators without planes, cooks, even clerks, all were handed rifles or swords. The wounded strapped bayonets to crutches and wrapped torn uniforms tighter around their wounds. Civilians were not spared. Women and children were armed with bamboo spears, grenades, and told to follow in the second wave. Those too wounded to walk were given explosives and ordered to detonate themselves when the Americans passed. Saipan was no longer just a battlefield. It was about to become a ritual sacrifice. On the American side, unease spread quietly among the lines. Marine artillery observer Corporal James Whelan sat on a damp hilltop with his binoculars pressed against tired eyes. Through the glass, he caught unusual movements in Japanese positions. Groups of men clustered together, fires extinguished, artillery strangely silent. The enemy, usually scattered in caves and foxholes, was now gathering in unnerving numbers. He scribbled notes into his pad, grid 164-223, estimated 4000 plus approaching, request all available batteries, this is not a probe. His voice crackled urgently over the radio to the Fire Direction Center. Deep inside the American camp, officers studied maps lit by red lamps. They too sensed something coming. Intelligence had already intercepted fragments of Japanese communication. The silence of enemy artillery told its own story. They were saving every last shell for a final stand. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines, repositioned his men that evening. He placed his strongest companies at the most likely avenues of attack and ensured every forward observer had backup communication lines. Before the night fell, he gave his men a warning they would never forget. "We all feel it. Tonight will be different." As dusk melted into night, Marines along the line checked their rifles, their mortar crews cutting open crates of shells. Gunners of the 10th Marine Artillery Regiment stood by their howitzers, fuses set, range tables ready. Offshore, battleships and cruisers turned their turrets inland, awaiting the call. In the foxholes, young Marines whispered nervously, their faces pale in the dim glow of cigarettes. Some tried to joke, masking the fear. Others prayed quietly, fingering small Bibles tucked into breast pockets. One private scribbled a letter to his mother, unfinished as the ground beneath him began to tremble. At 4:30 in the morning of July 7th, the silence broke. First came the chants, low at first, then rising, a thunderous roar of thousands. Banzai, Banzai. The valley erupted with the sound of fury as the Imperial Japanese Army launched the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War. And waiting for them, hidden in the darkness, was the deadliest artillery network the world had ever seen. The cries came first, deep, guttural, almost inhuman in their ferocity. Banzai, Banzai. It rolled like thunder across the Tanapag Plain, echoing from the ridges, magnified by thousands of voices in unison. Marines who had fought in Guadalcanal and Tarawa would later say they had never heard anything so chilling. The sound was not just noise. It was a force, a wall of fury meant to terrify and overwhelm before the first shot was fired. Through the pre-dawn gloom, the silhouettes emerged. Row after row, a human tide, pressing forward with terrifying determination. Officers marched at the front, swords gleaming in the dim light. Behind them came men with bayonets fixed, some still wearing blood-soaked bandages limping forward, their uniforms tattered. Some were carried on stretchers, holding rifles across their chests. Behind them, astonishingly, came civilians, women clutching bamboo spears, boys barely teenagers, and old men too frail to run but determined to walk toward death. Even the severely wounded who could not walk had strapped grenades to their bodies, waiting for the chance to pull the pin. For the Japanese, this was not simply battle. It was ritual. Gyukyus, to shatter like a jewel, was their final gift to the emperor. Surrender was worse than death. Survival without victory was dishonor. To die in a Banzai charge was to achieve transcendence. They would prove, once and for all, that spirit was stronger than steel. The Americans, however, were not fighting with spirit alone. Hidden in foxholes, Marines and soldiers stared in awe as the human wave rolled closer. Some froze, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. It was like something from another century. Napoleonic lines, samurai ethos reborn, clashing against modern weapons. One Marine whispered hoarsely, "My God, they're all coming." Another gripped his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. The valley floor shook with the pounding of thousands of feet. Corporal James Whelan, crouched with his radio, kept his voice steady as he called it in. Fire mission. Grid 164-2, 123, enemy infantry in the open. Estimated regiment strength moving south. Immediate suppression. Time on target. The reply came in seconds, calm and precise. Roger, all available batteries. Splash in 90 seconds. While the Japanese roared forward, the Americans prepared the deadliest symphony of destruction ever orchestrated in the Pacific. Still, before the first shells fell, the defenders opened up with rifles, machine guns, and mortars. The front lines lit up with bursts of fire as tracers cut into the advancing horde. Japanese soldiers fell by the dozens, but the wave did not falter. Men stumbled over bodies and kept running, bayonets gleaming. Some screamed so loud their voices cracked, their battle cries echoing even as bullets tore through them. The defenders of the 105th Infantry Regiment fired until barrels glowed red, sweat pouring down their faces. Machine gunners pulled triggers without pause, their belts of ammunition disappearing in seconds. Yet still the enemy came relentless, unstoppable in spirit if not in flesh. Then the sky split open. At exactly 0:44:7 the first barrage hit. Dozens of artillery tubes had fired from across the island, each calculated to land at the same moment. The ground heaved as hundreds of shells exploded in unison. The first ranks of the bands, I charge, vanished in fire and steel, torn apart before they even realized they were under bombardment. Time on target had arrived. From behind the American lines, the 10th Marines howitzers boomed, joined by Army long-toms, mortars, and naval guns from battleships offshore. The valley became a cauldron. Shells rained down in perfect rhythm, coordinated by slide rules, plotting boards, and forward observers who calmly adjusted fire amid chaos. Each detonation ripped holes through the human tide, scattering limbs, bodies, weapons. Still, the Japanese advanced. Survivors clambered over mangled corpses, charging with bayonets raised. Groups found temporary cover in ravines, only for forward observers to call in corrections that brought air. Burst shells raining directly over their heads. One observer described it later. It was like watching wheat being cut by a scythe. They came in rows, and our fire just mowed them down. The valley was now alive with chaos. Marines shouted orders above the roar of artillery. Mortar teams lobbed shells rapidly, the tubes glowing hot. Corpsmen dragged wounded men back from the lines, even as more fell into their places. Japanese soldiers broke through the first curtain of fire and reached barbed wire barriers, throwing themselves bodily onto the metal to allow comrades behind them to pass. Some hurled grenades blindly, others fired wildly while screaming Banzai at the top of their lungs. A young Marine private, barely 19, recalled years later, "They just kept coming. You'd think they were finished, but then another wave would appear. It was like fighting ghosts that wouldn't stop dying." Behind the artillery lines, officers worked furiously to maintain the symphony of fire. Battery commanders relayed firing data with machine-like precision, crews cutting fuses in seconds, adjusting elevation, wiping sweat from their eyes. Every shell mattered, every second counted. The Japanese had chosen to meet modern science with raw courage, and the result was slaughter. By 0:5:30, the bands I charge had pushed only 400 yards, at the cost of thousands of lives. The valley floor was littered with bodies, torn uniforms, shattered weapons. Still, clusters of Japanese soldiers pressed forward, undeterred, screaming defiantly as they fell. The Americans had prepared for a fight. What they hadn't expected was the sheer scale of sacrifice. By dawn, it was clear this was no ordinary battle. This was the last great bands I charge, an entire army hurling itself into oblivion. And the worst was yet to come. The first shells tore into the earth like thunderbolts, but what followed was something far more terrifying. A storm of steel that seemed to consume the entire valley. From Saipan's ridges to its beaches, American artillery roared as one. 12 battalions of guns, mortars, and naval batteries unleashed their fury in perfect harmony. To the Japanese charging forward, it must have felt as though the heavens themselves had turned against them. This was no random barrage, no scattered fire. It was science, mathematics, and deadly coordination forged into a weapon unlike anything the Imperial Army had ever faced. The Americans called it time on target. Instead of firing when ready, each gun calculated precisely when to shoot so that shells from near and far landed together in a single, catastrophic instant. Dozens of batteries fired at staggered moments, their trajectories adjusted for distance, air temperature, and even the rotation of the Earth. Crews worked with mechanical precision, cutting fuses, loading shells, pulling lanyards. The result was devastating. Hundreds of explosions erupted across the plain at the same second, swallowing the Japanese wave in simultaneous blasts. It was as if the earth itself had erupted. Men were flung skyward, bayonets and rifles torn from their hands. Entire squads disappeared into smoke and fire. One Marine forward observer described it later in awe. It wasn't like firing artillery. It was like watching a god reach down and smash the enemy flat. Yet the firestorm didn't end there. Behind the artillery lines, the fire direction centers worked furiously, their plotting boards glowing under red lamps. Slide rules clicked, grease pencils scratched, voices barked coordinates over headsets. Corrections streamed in from forward observers crouched on ridges with binoculars, calmly relaying adjustments even as shells exploded around them. Drop 200, left 100, repeat fire. The commands moved like electricity. Seconds later, entire batteries shifted their aim, and another wall of explosions ripped through the Japanese formations. It was war transformed into mathematics, destruction orchestrated like a symphony. Then came the naval guns. Offshore, the battleship USS Tennessee and cruiser USS Louisville swung their massive turrets toward the island. Fire control officers aboard the ships adjusted their range, receiving precise coordinates from shore parties. When the orders came, the night sky lit up. 14-inch shells from the Tennessee shrieked overhead, followed by 8-inch shells from the Louisville. They landed among the Japanese columns with shattering force, carving craters the size of houses. The ground trembled with each hit. Star shells burst overhead, turning night into day, exposing the attackers in ghostly white light. The Japanese charge became a nightmare of chaos. Bodies littered the ground in tangled heaps. Men stumbled over the dead, still screaming Banzai, even as shrapnel tore through them. Some crawled forward on hands and knees, dragging rifles, their uniforms shredded. Others hurled themselves into the explosions willingly, determined to die in motion. Still, they came. This was the essence of Gyakusai. To the Japanese soldier, it was not madness, it was honor. To stop was to shame one's ancestors. To turn back was to dishonor the emperor. So they pressed forward, even as the world collapsed around them. American gunners, though hardened by years of war, were shaken by the sight. One Marine gunner later wrote in his diary, "I have never seen men so willing to die. We fired, they fell. We fired again, and more came. It felt endless, like killing shadows that refused to fade." By 0530, the firestorm had devastated the Japanese wave. Of the thousands who had surged forward, only scattered clusters remained. Yet those clusters pressed on with unbelievable tenacity. Through gaps in the artillery, groups of 10, 20, sometimes 50 soldiers clawed their way forward, crawling through ravines and gullies, using the dead as cover. Forward observers saw them and calmly adjusted fire. New barrages fell across those hiding spots, blasting ravines into open graves. Artillerymen employed a brutal tactic known as ladder fire, shelling one line, then walking the explosions backward across the enemy's ranks, then forward again, back and forth like a giant scythe cutting down wheat. The Japanese ranks thinned with each pass, their momentum slowed to a crawl, and yet impossibly, some reached the American lines. By 0600, the first groups of Japanese soldiers slammed into the 105th Infantry's front positions. Grenades flew, rifles cracked, and bayonets clashed. The battle that had begun as an artillery massacre now descended into a brutal, desperate melee. American howitzers that could no longer fire safely depressed their barrels and blasted shells point blank into charging soldiers. Gunners who couldn't fire at all grabbed carbines and pistols, transforming from artillerymen to infantry in an instant. Still the Japanese came, staggering, bloodied, relentless. Marines who had been through Guadalcanal admitted they had never seen anything like it. It wasn't just battle, it was suicide on an industrial scale. By sunrise, the Tanapag Plain had become a wasteland. Smoke hung over the field like a shroud. The once slush valleys were cratered moonscapes, strewn with bodies and wreckage. Shells had stripped the ground bare, turning vegetation into twisted splinters. Thousands of corpses carpeted the earth, some burned, others dismembered, many frozen in mid-charge, rifles clutched tight. An American officer stood stunned, surveying the scene. He muttered almost to himself, "This isn't war, this is annihilation." The firestorm had broken the Japanese wave, but the cost in human life, Japanese and American alike, was only beginning to sink in. The artillery storm had torn the Japanese apart, but it had not destroyed their will. By dawn, scattered groups of survivors still pressed forward, determined to reach the American lines. They stumbled through smoke and craters, blood soaking their uniforms, eyes wild with fury. Many carried rifles with fixed bayonets, others clutched grenades to their chests, ready to die in an instant. Some were so badly wounded they could only crawl, yet they crawled forward all the same. The 105th Infantry Regiment bore the brunt of this final surge. Their positions were thin, stretched across the valley, already hammered by hours of fighting. By 0600, Japanese soldiers began breaching gaps in the barbed wire and throwing themselves into foxholes. The carefully coordinated artillery barrages gave way to chaos, hand-to-hand combat, where survival depended on raw instinct and sheer willpower. American machine gunners fired until their barrels overheated, then switched to rifles and pistols. Mortar crews dropped shells dangerously close to their own lines, trying to halt the tide. Corpsmen, instead of treating the wounded, picked up carbines and joined the defense. Even cooks and clerks stationed near the rear grabbed weapons and ran forward. The battle was no longer a contest of technology alone. It was man against man, courage against courage. Among the chaos, acts of extraordinary valor would be etched into history. Lieutenant Colonel William J. O'Brien, commander of the 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry, O'Brien had already been wounded twice that morning. Blood soaked his uniform, but he refused evacuation. As Japanese soldiers swarmed through a gap in the line, O'Brien climbed onto a jeep, manned a .50 caliber machine gun, and began cutting down attackers. His voice carried above the chaos, shouting encouragement to his men as he raked the charging enemy with fire. When the gun jammed and ammunition ran out, he drew his sidearm. Pistols in both hands, he kept firing as enemy soldiers closed around him. Witnesses later said he fought until he disappeared beneath a wave of bayonets and rifle butts. When his body was recovered, more than 30 Japanese soldiers lay dead around him. His sacrifice had bought his men precious time to regroup. Private Thomas A. Baker, in another sector of the line, Private Baker of Company, fought like a man possessed. Armed with a bazooka, he destroyed a Japanese strongpoint, then grabbed his rifle and shot wave after wave of attackers. At one point, he stood in an open trench, firing until his weapon clicked empty, then switching to his pistol. Eyewitnesses later counted more than 24 enemy dead at his position. Severely wounded and unable to stand, Baker refused evacuation. He handed his comrades his last pistol, telling them, "Get the hell away from me." When the line was retaken hours later, Baker was found slumped against a tree, an empty .45 in his hand, 8 Japanese bodies surrounding him. His defiance became legendary, a symbol of the fight's desperate brutality. Captain Benjamin L. Solomon, near an aid station, Captain Solomon, a dentist serving as battalion surgeon, was treating the wounded when Japanese soldiers burst through the tent flaps. He grabbed a rifle, shot 4 attackers on the spot, and ordered the wounded evacuated. Then, positioning himself at a machine gun, he covered their withdrawal. For hours he fired without pause, mowing down wave after wave of attackers until his body was found slumped over the gun, riddled with bullets and bayonet wounds. 98 Japanese corpses lay before his position. Though his Medal of Honor would not be awarded until decades later, his courage in that moment saved hundreds of lives. The battle raged without pause. Japanese soldiers hurled themselves into trenches, stabbing with bayonets, striking with rifle butts, clawing with bare hands. Americans countered with knives, shovels, even fists when ammunition ran dry. One Marine later described it as a blur of faces, screams, and blood, like the world had gone insane. Artillerymen, normally far from the front, now fought as infantry. When Japanese soldiers overran the positions of the 10th Marines' guns, crews removed the firing locks from their howitzers and turned to rifles. Some depressed their barrels and blasted point blank into the charging enemy, shells ricocheting through ranks at lethal angles. Despite the carnage, the Japanese would not stop. Groups of 20, then 10, then even single soldiers kept charging. Some carried no weapons at all, only grenades held tightly in both hands. Others feigned death among corpses, then rose suddenly to attack. It was warfare at its most desperate, savage, unrelenting, stripped of all strategy except one, die-killing. By mid-morning, the ground was slick with blood. The once green valley was now a field of craters and bodies. American casualties mounted, hundreds killed or wounded in the frantic defense. Yet the line held. Through sheer determination and the weight of firepower, the Americans repelled wave after wave. One officer, his voice hoarse and uniform shredded, summed it up in a single exhausted line. "We didn't fight men that morning. We fought death itself, dressed in Japanese uniforms." By 07:30, the charge had splintered. What began as an organized assault had devolved into scattered pockets of resistance. Small bands of survivors tried to regroup in gullies and ravines, only to be destroyed by renewed artillery barrages. Naval shells pounded assembly points. Mortars walked fire systematically across the battlefield. By 09:00, the last coherent attacks had dissolved into chaos. The valley was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard. But even as the smoke cleared, the survivors among the Americans knew they had witnessed something beyond imagination, a collision of courage and steel, where men on both sides had fought with unimaginable ferocity. And yet, only one side had the means to survive. The sun rose slowly over Saipan, its pale light spreading across a landscape that no longer looked human. Where once there had been fields and jungle, now there was only ruin, craters, splintered trees, smoldering earth, and bodies. Thousands of bodies. The Tanapag plain was carpeted with death. Japanese soldiers lay in heaps where the artillery had torn through them, their once proud battle cries silenced forever. Some had fallen with bayonets still clutched in their hands, frozen mid-charge. Others lay twisted and broken, their bodies flung across rocks and trenches by the force of explosions. The smell of blood and cordite hung thick in the morning air, clinging to every breath the survivors took. American soldiers and Marines, weary beyond words, climbed from their foxholes to survey the destruction. What they saw defied belief: an entire army obliterated. More than 4,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians had charged the night before. Almost none remained. Corpsmen moved slowly across the battlefield, searching for signs of life. Here and there, a Japanese soldier stirred, wounded but defiant, clutching a grenade to his chest. The corpsmen approached carefully, but many of the wounded detonated themselves rather than surrender. Others feigned death, only to lunge with knives or bayonets when Americans drew close. For hours, the battlefield was still dangerous, a place where even the dying sought to kill. By late morning, organized fighting had ceased. The surviving Japanese who could not reach American lines crawled back toward the northern cliffs, where caves and ravines offered cover. Some disappeared into those dark recesses, vowing to continue the fight as guerrillas. But for the thousands who lay on the field, the battle was over. The Americans had paid a heavy price as well. The 105th Infantry Regiment alone suffered over 400 dead and 500 wounded, nearly 80% casualties. The men were exhausted, hollow-eyed, their uniforms blackened by smoke and caked with blood. Survivors moved like shadows, silent, stunned by what they had endured. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers, whose Marines had withstood the main assault, recorded in his report, "There is no glory in what we did. We killed thousands of brave men who never had a chance. Yes, they tried to kill us. Yes, it was necessary. But turning artillery into an assembly line of death is not war as our fathers knew it." That sentiment was echoed across the lines. Many Marines had fought in brutal battles before, but nothing had prepared them for the scale of the slaughter. To kill an enemy face to face was one thing. To mow down thousands with mechanized precision was another. One private muttered to a comrade as he lit a cigarette with trembling hands, "This wasn't a battle, this was a massacre." Graves registration teams soon arrived to begin their grim work. The sheer number of bodies overwhelmed them. Japanese corpses were counted by the hundreds, stacked in rows, then buried in mass graves dug into the earth. Official reports recorded 311 Japanese dead from the charge. The true number was likely higher, as many were obliterated beyond recognition by artillery. The sight left deep psychological scars. Soldiers who had once joked about stacking Japs like cordwood now fell silent. The reality of what they saw, the humanity of the men who had charged, the futility of their sacrifice, haunted them. Some stared at the faces of the dead and realized they were boys no older than themselves, led to die by commanders who valued honor more than life. Among the Japanese bodies were civilians, women with bamboo spears, teenagers who had charged alongside soldiers, and even the wounded carried on stretchers. For American soldiers hardened by years of propaganda that painted the enemy as faceless fanatics, the sight was sobering. They had killed not just an army, but a people who had been convinced that death was the only path left. In caves and bunkers, the last whispers of resistance lingered. Small groups of Japanese refused to surrender, emerging at night for desperate suicide attacks. Some held out for weeks, surviving on rainwater and scraps. Others would not surrender until after Japan itself had capitulated a year later. For them, Saipan had become sacred ground, a place where they had chosen death rather than dishonor. For the Americans, victory came at a terrible cost. Nearly 1,000 killed and wounded in a single night, many cut down in their foxholes as the Japanese wave crashed against them. The 105th Infantry, in particular, was nearly destroyed as a fighting unit. Yet the cold mathematics of war told the truth. The Americans had lost hundreds, but the Japanese had lost thousands. The ratio was staggering: 4 dead Japanese for every 1 American casualty. By noon, as the smoke cleared and the last echoes of battle faded, Saipan belonged to the United States. The largest bands, a charge of the Pacific War, had ended not with triumph, but with annihilation. For the Japanese soldiers who had charged into the valley, it was the end of a dream. That courage and spirit could overcome technology and firepower. For the Americans who had survived, it was a nightmare they would never forget. One Marine, interviewed years later, tried to explain what it felt like. "We didn't win that night. We survived the Japanese. They died like warriors, but they died for nothing, and we had to watch it happen. That's something you don't ever forget." As the sun climbed higher in the Saipan sky, the battlefield lay silent, a graveyard for thousands. The ground itself seemed to mourn, and yet, for all the horror, the Americans knew this truth: the war was far from over. Saipan was just one island. Ahead lay Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each with their own valleys of death. But on this morning, as the survivors stood among the carnage, one reality was clear: the age of the bands. A charge had ended forever. The valley of Tanapag was still littered with bodies when the truth sank in, not just for the Americans who had survived, but for the Japanese command that had ordered the charge. The largest Banzai assault of the Pacific War had not broken American lines. It had not reclaimed Saipan. Instead, it had annihilated the last remnants of Japan's garrison in one catastrophic act of collective suicide. For the Imperial Japanese Army, the Saipan bands, a charge was both a tragedy and a turning point. It marked the final death of an illusion, that courage and spiritual resolve could overcome the cold precision of modern firepower. For centuries, Japan had believed in the invincibility of the samurai spirit. For decades, their leaders had insisted that American soldiers were soft, unprepared to withstand the fury of men willing to die for honor. But on July 7, 1944, that belief was buried beneath thousands of corpses. General Yoshitsugu Sato, the man who had ordered the charge, would not live to see the aftermath. 3 days later, he committed seppuku in his cave command post, his death an act of ritual that matched the destruction he had unleashed on his men. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had once commanded the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, had already taken his own life the day before the charge. Their deaths symbolized more than personal despair. They were the symbolic collapse of Japan's Pacific dream. For America, the victory at Saipan was more than tactical. Strategically, it was devastating to Japan's war effort. With Saipan secured, U.S. bombers were now within range of Tokyo. In the months that followed, B-29s would rise from Saipan's airfields to rain destruction upon Japan's cities, turning the homeland itself into a battlefield. Admiral Asami Nagano, chief of the Japanese Naval General Staff, would later confess, "Our war was lost with the loss of Saipan." Yet for the men who had fought there, victory carried no joy. The soldiers of the 105th Infantry and the Marines who had held their lines that night carried scars that went deeper than wounds. They had witnessed an entire army destroy itself against their guns. The efficiency of the killing, the industrial rhythm of artillery fire, had stripped war of any illusion of glory. Captain Edmund G. Love, the 27th Division's historian, captured the mood best. Men who had seen everything before were shaken, not by fear. The Japanese never really had a chance, but by the sheer scale of the killing. They had been part of something mechanical, soulless. It was not battle. It was extermination. That was the bitter lesson of Saipan. In the age of artillery coordination, radar, fire direction centers, and massed firepower, human bravery alone was powerless. The Japanese had thrown 4,000 men into the flames of modern warfare, and the fire had consumed them utterly. The charge's failure was not only military, it was cultural. The doctrine of Jyokusai, of shattering like a jewel in glorious death, had guided Japanese strategy since the war in China. But on Saipan, it was revealed for what it was: mass suicide dressed in ritual words. The courage of the men was undeniable, but their sacrifice achieved nothing except destruction. Courage without technology, honor without pragmatism. These could not win a modern war. The Americans, for their part, had learned to see bans. Charges not as terror, but as opportunity. By 1944, they had perfected countermeasures, time-on-target barrages, ladder fire tactics, integrated naval gunfire, and forward observers tied to every infantry company. The Japanese came screaming with bayonets. The Americans answered with mathematics, radios, and steel. The result was not in doubt. It never had been. And yet, even in defeat, the Japanese spirit haunted the survivors. Marines and soldiers admitted they had never fought men so willing to die. Even as artillery shredded them, even as machine guns cut them down in waves, the Japanese kept coming. To Americans, hardened by battles across the Pacific, it seemed like fighting death itself. One Marine sergeant later confessed, "I respected them even as I hated it. They didn't break. They just ended." The consequences rippled far beyond Saipan. In Tokyo, news of the defeat contributed directly to the fall of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government. In Washington, it confirmed the brutal reality that Japan would never surrender willingly, that only overwhelming destruction could force their hand. Less than a year later, that belief would culminate in the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the deeper legacy of Saipan was doctrinal. Never again would massed infantry charges be attempted against modern firepower. The age of bayonet waves and cavalry-style assaults ended in that valley. Warfare had become something new, an industrial process, where victory went not to the bravest, but to those with the best systems. Artillery, logistics, communications, and coordination mattered more than courage or honor. In later wars, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, armies would repeat the lessons of Saipan. Human waves would crash against artillery and airstrikes, always with the same result. The Japanese soldiers of Saipan had been among the last in history to believe spirit could triumph over steel. Their courage was extraordinary, but their commanders had led them into a furnace from which no man could return. At the 50th anniversary commemoration of Saipan in 1994, Survivors from both sides gathered. An American veteran, Arthur Robinson of the 105th Infantry, stood silently at the valley's edge, remembering that terrible morning. His words carried the weight of half a century. "You have to understand, we didn't want to kill them all, but they kept coming, wave after wave. Our artillery just cut them down. It was horrible, but what choice did we have? The efficiency of the killing haunted us. We won, but it never felt like victory." The bands, "I Charge at Saipan," was the last of its kind, the final collision of warrior spirit with modern firepower. When the smoke cleared, the truth was undeniable. Bravery without technology was no longer enough. The samurai tradition had died in the valley of Saipan, shattered by American artillery that turned war into mathematics. In that place, courage met coordination, spirit met system, tradition met technology. And technology won.